Hello and welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be looking at historiography and the study of history. As a history course, and given the nature of your final project for this class, it's extremely important to understand not just what history is, but what historiography is. Put simply, historiography is the study of history. Or, put even more accurately, it's the study of the study of history.
Dream within a dream, huh? I'm impressed.
In other words, a large part of what I do as a historian is study what previous historians have said about the past. The study of history. As convoluted as that may sound, that is the essential basis of what we as historians do. We constantly are reinterpreting and re-understanding the past. And as we do that, through writing, we are convincing other people of these interpretations. Now, as a historian, I can't just come out with some bold new claim that's completely unsubstantiated. I can't just say, hey, actually, the Civil War, the American Civil War, it never happened. It was a big propaganda piece that came out, never actually happened. I can make that claim, but without evidence, it's just a claim. It's not an argument. Arguments require evidence. That is one of the main things that hopefully you all take away from this course. When you make claims, you must back them up with evidence. This is very different than what we're used to doing in our day-to-day activity. When you're with your friends, oftentimes you'll make a claim or you'll make an argument, and very rarely does it rely on actual evidence. In this course, though, evidence is the foundation of history. After all, what has happened in the past has already happened. One way or another, maybe from one perspective or another, of course, but it happened. The past is in the past. My job as a historian, and your jobs as students of history, is not just to explain what happened in the past. It's to constantly recreate what happened in the past based on our limited understanding of it, but also to take that knowledge and turn it towards the future, towards our present day and age. In other words, what does this mean? What does the past do for us? Why do we care what happened in the past? That is the twofold responsibility of the historian. Now, historiography, or the study of history, dates back for thousands of years. This is not a recent phenomenon. And in terms of the historiography, in this course, you'll largely be looking at two main types and main categories of historiography. In other words, you'll mainly be looking at scholars, historians, historical scholars, in one of two camps. Either A, historians who are interpreting and making claims and arguing about a specific historical period. So what do historians say about ancient Rome? What do historians say about the medieval era? That is the first type of historian. The second type of historian, type of historiography, is what do historians think and what do scholars think about the effectiveness of video games? The utility and the effectiveness of video games. So as you'll see in the syllabus with our readings, we'll be reading pieces that cover all three goals of this course. We'll be reading pieces from historians talking about video games. We'll be reading pieces from historians talking about actual history, the historical past, and we'll be reading pieces from the historical past. And the interesting and engaging part about all this historiography and the history behind it is that it's constantly in flux. It's constantly being re-navigated, reinterpreted, and it's constantly going back and forth. There are very controversial issues, both in video games as well as in the past, that scholars are going back and forth on. Video games in itself is a fairly controversial topic. You'll probably remember about 15 years ago, the big craze was that violence in video games was making America's youth more violent. Now, that's largely been disproven, but we had very serious and learned scholars coming out and making these claims. Conversely, other sociologists and scholars came out and were making the opposite side. So, at its core, right, historiography is a debate. It's a scholarly debate. And obviously, as you insert yourselves into this debate, you need to be bringing strong argumentation and clear evidence to back up your points. These are the skills of the historian's craft. More recently with video games and their use as a teaching tool, there's also been split opinions. So for instance, in 2006, Paul Barrett came out with an article that was talking about how video games were a very, very negative phenomenon for education. How video games did more harm than they did good, and his particular focus, which was on Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, was on how video games inappropriately pushed racial ideas, negative racial ideas. So the race and the violence and the sort of fantasy of violence that is at the core of the Grand Theft Auto series was what Paul Barrett really blasted video games for. Conversely, we've had other articles and other scholars who have written about how these video games are actually a very important teaching tool and how they're able to approach history and simulate history from ways other media and other forms of education simply cannot do as effectively. In fact, Stephen Johnson came out with a book that same year in 2006 called Everything Bad is Good for You. And he again is really arguing against this sort of negative backlash against video games as well as other media, as well as television and movies. There was a big uproar when it became more common to use these sorts of media in the classroom as a teaching tool. Some scholars and even some politicians came out and said that these form of popular media are bad for us. They're bad for the country and they're bad for our students. Stephen Johnson's book concludes, though, that all of these quote-unquote bad things, everything bad, is actually good for us. That the core of a lot of our learning, both social and academic, actually stems from the culture, our culture, that's steeped in these video games, these movies, and these forms of popular mass culture. So when you hear historiography, you want to be thinking about the study of history, but in other words, it is this ongoing scholarly debate. In other words, what happened 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome, it's not static. It is a very fluctual, dynamic debate that is constantly going on, constantly changing, and constantly adapting. And as much as it's informed by the past and our evidence of the past, it's also informed by our own modern-day biases. In other words, what I have experienced in my life necessarily informs my understanding of the past. So for instance, those who lived through the civil rights and the women's movement of the 60s and 70s and the feminist movement of the 80s and 90s, they are very willing and very excited to bring a feminist lens onto the past. So how does thinking about Rome in light of women affect our view of the past? Similarly, those who approach more of a Marxist lens, how does class structure and how does Marxist theory affect our understanding of the past? So it's through these different lenses, it's through these different understandings of the past that different opinions and different interpretations are formed. Because of all these historical tools we have, lenses through which to look at the past, it's no wonder that we constantly keep coming up with new interpretations and new ways to look at the past. After all, as human beings, the past is influenced by our own present understanding. This is societal as much as it is personal. Those who grew up in World War II and those who grew up in the Cold War have a very different understanding of geopolitics and of the world history than, for instance, we do as millennials. Even further than this, you may have different understandings of the past based on the stability of your family, based on the part of the country you grew up in, based on your parents' professions, based on your socioeconomic class. There's so many factors that form our own understandings and our own worldview to the point where they also affect our interpretations of other aspects of life, including the historical past. It's very important then as historians to be very knowledgeable about our own biases, about your own personal baggage that you bring into the discussion of the past. That is the historiographical side. That is the human side of things, in which you are a human interpreting the past. The other side is what you are interpreting. What actually happened in the past, at least as closely as we can get to it. This brings up an important question. What do we know about the past? What do we know about it? So whether you are a lifelong expert or whether you have very little experience in certain areas of history, we all know different things about the past, or at least we think we know. So for instance, when you think about the ancient world, what do I know about the ancient world? You may think Julius Caesar, or you may think King Tut and King Tut's tomb. You also may think Troy or the Colosseum, gladiators, right? A lot of the stuff is obviously informed by our popular understanding. Maybe you think Rise, Son of Rome, or maybe you think God of War, or maybe you're thinking Gladiator, or Troy, or Alexander, or HBO's Rome, right? All of these interpretations of the past. You may also have been told certain things about the past. Maybe you have a friend who does ancient history. Or more likely, when you were in high school and you took world history, you learned about the ancient past. Maybe not a lot, maybe a little, but you learned certain things. That teacher, they told you something about the past. So you have all of these things about the past that you know. Or at least you've been told all these things about the past. This gets to the second and really the more important question. How do we know about the past? How do we know anything about the past? This is what you need to keep in mind as you think about the video games we're going to look at, as you think about the history we're going to look at, and as you think about what historical argumentation is. When you make a claim, you have to back it up. You have to have evidence. And this evidence gets to this question. How do we know anything about the past? Whether we're talking about the Renaissance, or the American Civil War, or World War II, or ancient Rome, any period that is beyond the last few years, how do we know anything about it? So think about that. What are some avenues for us to gain this knowledge? It may be accurate, it may not be accurate, but how do we reach these interpretations? When we think about ancient Rome, why do we talk about gladiators at all? Why aren't we talking about unicorns? Or why aren't we talking about massive amounts of people who got together in the middle of a great arena and square danced for hours? How do we know any of this happened? How do we know any of this? Now, there's really 4 main avenues for this knowledge. Now, before we answer that, there's a distinction that we really need to explore, to explain. And that is the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. Put simply, a primary source is evidence, right? It's a source that gives us information about what happened at the time. It's a contemporary source. Comes from the time period in question. So if we're talking about the Civil War, we're talking about something that happened or that came from the 1860s. Conversely, secondary sources are sources that come along after that themselves analyze the primary sources. In other words, there's a book, let's say, from the 1860s that is a primary source, and then last year, a historian comes out with a book talking about that book, or talking about that book in context of the Civil War. That would be a secondary source. It is a step removed. It's looking back. It's not explaining what is currently happening. That's the distinction. Primary source, secondary source. Now in history, in historical argumentation, primary sources are the gold. They're the meat and potatoes of your argument. In other words, if you're talking about the Civil War and you say, you know what, the Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the war. Not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of commanders killed and long-term casualties and all of these things. Now, that's a claim. For you to have an actual argument to that effect, you need evidence. You may want to bring in this recent scholar who talks about Gettysburg. What really matters, though, is the primary source. What does evidence from that time tell us about these casualties, about this battle? It's always more powerful. We have this understanding in our own judicial system. If you go to court and you have a witness who is telling the jury what an actual eyewitness said, again, a step removed, it gets thrown out. It's called hearsay. It's not as strong as that actual evidence, that actual eyewitness. Getting back to our question, what are the 4 main ways that we have knowledge of the past? How do we know anything? Way number 1 are secondary sources. Now, this could be a museum, a video game, a book, an article, a lecture. Me discussing the past with you is a secondary source. You are looking back towards the time period, interpreting it, reanalyzing it, etc. Way number 1, secondary source. The other 3 ways are all primary sources. The first way you might know about the past is that you were actually there. You yourself were an eyewitness. So for instance, when we think about our understanding of World War II, there are still people alive who fought in World War II. They themselves have knowledge about that event because they were there. Again, the knowledge might be a little corrupted, or they may not remember it, and of course they only have one slant, one angle, one interpretation, but that is a primary source. It is from that time. Now obviously, unless we're talking about the last 80 years, we will not have eyewitnesses. And most likely, none of you or myself are eyewitnesses to these historical periods we will be talking about. That then leads us to the second main way we know about the past. Accounts from eyewitnesses, or accounts from those contemporary to the time. There's a person who was alive during this event or during this time period, and obviously we can't interview them because they're long dead. Luckily for us, though, they wrote an account. They wrote a diary, they wrote a history, they wrote a memoir. Whatever we have it, we now have this access, this primary account. This is the main way we know anything about the past. The third and final way, which is equally important, although sometimes underutilized, is what's called material culture. This is mainly what you're going to see at a museum. This is archaeological evidence. It can be a tombstone, arrowheads, musket balls, gold from an Egyptian tomb, coins with images, whatever have you. It's material culture. So a lot of times we're able to use this material culture to verify or even to contradict what the primary text accounts say. In this way, we have to use all of these different sources, all these different avenues of knowledge to recreate our understanding of the past. This is obviously an extremely difficult task, not just for us as historians, but also given the long trail of transmission that this knowledge often takes. Let's take Julius Caesar, for example, a famous general and leader from ancient Rome. We'll talk about him more in week 3. He wrote a personal account of the wars that he fought in Gaul, in modern-day France. We still have this account. So it's a very useful glimpse into, Roman warfare and the situation of the Gauls and tribes and druids, as well as Caesar's own politics and the political climate of that time period in Rome. But there are issues with it. First off, Caesar himself is writing it. He's certainly not an objective source. He is writing it in a lot of ways to boost his own credentials and his own popularity back in Rome. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, it was written over 2,000 years ago, which means that the only reason we still have access to it today in its full form is that it was constantly copied and recopied and recopied by medieval monks. That means that there could be mistakes or inconsistencies across all of these transmissions. Even worse than that, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars was written in Latin, which is great if you know how to speak and read Latin. For most people reading it, though, they don't, which means that since it's been translated from Latin back into English, further obscuring its meaning, further obscuring some of the subtleties behind it, making it even harder to understand its true message or its true meaning. And again, that depends on how true it was in its initial composition. When you deal with sources, both primary sources as well as secondary interpretations of them, you have to be critical. It's okay to question the legitimacy and the veracity of a source. It's okay to disagree with it. Always, you need evidence. To demonstrate just how difficult this can be, let's go ahead and turn to an ancient historian named Polybius. So at this point, if you haven't already, you need to pause this lecture, go to the Elms file, the readings folder, and pull open that Polybius file. It's only a single page long. I need you to go to it, read through that, and then resume this lecture. Now that you've read that short snippet from Polybius's histories, here's the question. Based on just these two chapters, right, chapter 19 and 20 from his 6th book, what do we know is true? With no other context, with no other understanding of Rome or the Roman military or the Roman state, what is true? And obviously, we aren't going to be able to say with just 100% blatant certainty, this is true, this is true. So let's say, what is most likely true? Even if you're wrong, it was a reasonable guess to make based on what I've just read. For a few seconds, think about that. Based on what you just read about the appointment of these tribunes and the soldiers and forming the legions, what is true? What is most likely true? We can probably say with fairly reasonable certainty that some of the more basic, generic aspects of what we just read are true. Meaning that the Romans had soldiers. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Or that the Romans had infantry and the Romans had cavalry. Again, a reasonable assumption. The Romans had consuls. Reasonable assumption. So this should be the starting block. This is the foundation. Start general and then go more specific. So thinking more specific, okay, the Romans have consuls. We see that right at the beginning. After electing the consuls, yada, yada, yada. So first off, the fact that that's the introduction. So after this event, the election of the consuls, after this happens, then we move on to discussing the military. So from that fact alone, it's probably a reasonable guess that the consuls are a fairly important position or standing or office in Rome. We can say that. The Romans have consuls, and they're important. Not only are they important, but they are elected. Which means that in some capacity, we're not quite sure, but in some capacity, Rome has democratic processes. To some extent. Maybe representative processes, but they have some sort of democratic process in which consuls are elected. Another understanding from this, another truth we can reasonably assess is all of these aspects of the Roman military. You know, the military is important to the Romans. And clearly, they use it. There's a lot of warfare with the Romans. We can tell this by the emphasis that gets placed on military experience. So we have some military tribunes with 5 years experience, some military tribunes with 10 years experience. Polybius even says that anyone who wants to run for office in Rome has to have at least 10 years of military experience. If we could imagine that in contemporary times, can you imagine if every single one of our senators or our, city representatives or our congressmen or the president, if all of them had to have 10 years of experience, it'd be a very different dynamic of our government. But that is what Polybius claims to be the case in Rome. Another aspect of the military that we can glean, that we can tell from how it's described, is that over the course of these 30 years, let's say age 16 to 46, these Roman infantrymen are going to have to serve up to 16 years. That's their requirement. They may serve a lot less than that. They may serve that exactly, but they're not going to serve more than that. So there's a limit. The fact that there is a limit tells us that these are not professional soldiers. I don't mean professional in terms of their skill or their ferocity on the battlefield, but it is not a standing army. The US today, we have a standing army, meaning that many people, when they join the military, they join it as a career. We have an army right now, and in 5 years from now, we're going to have a fairly similar army. The same people, some new ones, some retire, but the same people are in the army. This is very different than, for instance, what we had during the Revolutionary War. The Roman soldiers are Roman citizens who fight for Rome out of some sort of civic duty. They get drafted, maybe they volunteer, they go into the army, and then they come home each year, or maybe after a few years. It's not a professional full-time deployment. Polybius also spends some time talking about the division of the army, the different classifications and all of this stuff. One of the things that we can glean from this is that there are actually wealth qualifications. So in determining who's the cavalry, who fights in the infantry, who rows the ships, there is actually a determining factor based on wealth. So it's not just a complete classless, socioeconomically free army. There are these wealth divisions. Polybius also gives us this lengthy and this detailed description of how the Romans really bend over backwards to make sure that every legion, all of the 4 legions, receive an equal amount and an equal quality of soldier. They have this sort of NFL draft style of picking one person at a time. Here's 4 good people, you get the first pick, and then you get the first pick, and then you get the first pick, round robin. It's this very, very painstaking process. They're very, very focused on making sure that there's an equal strength and an equal dispersion of both troops and officers across these 4 legions. The fact that we have these 4 legions gives us a reasonable guess to the strength of the Roman army every year. We have 4 legions. Polybius says that they have around 4,500 to 5,000, so we'll just say 5,000. So that means that the Roman army, combined over the 4 legions, probably has around 20,000 troops every year. Maybe that's right, maybe it's not right, but it's a reasonable guess. Also in this division, they mention Roman tribes, which means there's some sort of geographic or social classification, so they're broken down into tribes, whatever that means. It's something we know, we're not quite sure, but we can glean it from this passage. Another question based on reading this is, what do we know about Polybius? What do we know about the author of this work? It might be a reasonable guess to say, well, based on his description and his understanding of the positions, Polybius probably has military experience himself. You could also be reasonable to say he's probably Roman. He probably is a Roman citizen or something to that regard because he knows so much about the Roman breakdown of their army and such. We have all of these fairly reasonable assumptions that we're pulling off of this passage. We could go on, come up with 50 more, but for the sake of time, we'll leave it at that. But again, in really 2 paragraphs, we have formed all of these opinions of the past based on this single primary source evidence. So it's easy to see how you can spend a lot of time pulling and forming arguments and using this evidence to interpret and reinterpret the past, let alone just forming our understanding of the past. Some of what we said might be true, and some of it might not be true. For instance, our reasonable assumption that the Roman army probably has around 20,000 troops every year annually, that's actually not true. It's actually double that amount. Because for every single Roman legion on the field, they also have an allied legion accompanying them. We don't get that in this passage, but that's how it actually is. That doesn't mean that our assumption or our guess was unreasonable. It was a good guess, but that's why we need these multiple sources of evidence to go off of one another to form the most accurate, well-balanced opinion we can. Another example is Polybius. We says he has military experience. We say he's probably Roman. He's actually not Roman. He's actually a Greek historian who was a captive in Rome. And as a captive, he was able to look at the Roman archives and talk with leading Roman politicians and generals and get the inside scoop of what Rome was like. Even though that's the actual truth of the matter, our assertion that Polybius was a Roman or a Roman citizen, it's not unreasonable. This is why we need more than just this one passage to form our opinion of Polybius, of the Roman military, and of the past. We need multiple streams of evidence from multiple sources. This process of using these different primary source pieces of evidence, as well as going back to what other scholars have said to kind of build off of their opinions, that is what history is. It's the craft of forming arguments based on evidence and based on past interpretations. That is what history is. And because the work of other historians and modern scholars forms such an important basis for what history is in our writing and in our argument for history, it's very, very important that we rely on and we use and we engage with scholarly secondary sources. We'll talk about this in further detail once we look at the annotated bibliography assignment, but for now, just understand that not all secondary sources are created equally. By that, I mean that a book written by a historian that's been edited and peer-reviewed by other historians in the field about Julius Caesar, it's not the same merit or the same caliber as a special on Julius Caesar on the History Channel. Both secondary sources, one is scholarly, the other is not. So for your final paper and for the annotated bibliography in preparation for the final project, we will be looking at how to find those scholarly sources. Not just any secondary source, but a scholarly secondary source. And even when you do find and use and rely on these scholarly, well-researched, disciplined, smart secondary sources, it's always important that you do your own homework as well. This is why, for your argument and for your paper and for your understanding of history, it's so important that you go back to the primary sources. It's great to read what other historians and scholars have said about these topics, but in making an argument, you always need to go back to the actual source material, the primary source material. This is so important because sometimes historians are wrong. They're human, they make mistakes, and if you simply rely on them, you'll just be copying and transmitting the exact same mistake. There's a great example of this that has to do with Carthage. Carthage was the great enemy of Rome during Rome's rise to power. So it was a city in North Africa on the coast, and Rome fought a series of wars against Carthage, known as the Punic Wars. At the end of these Punic Wars, the third and final Punic War, Rome finally and completely obliterated Carthage, destroyed the city, and burnt it to the ground. Now, it used to be taught that after Rome destroyed the city, tore down the walls, that they actually came through with plows and sowed salt, actual salt, into the ground at Carthage so that nothing could ever grow there again, to make the land barren. That's how much they hated Carthage and how much they wanted to fully obliterate Carthage from the map. That's what has been taught. That's what I was taught in high school. That has been presented as fact about Rome and Carthage and the ancient world and the past. The only problem is that that never, ever happened. Never happened. It's completely made up. The reason why it was taught is because some German historian in the 19th century wrote that Rome salted the earth after they destroyed Carthage, and he put that into his history. How he thought that was true, who knows? Maybe he misinterpreted or misread some of the past material. However it happened, this well-known historian put this fact into his history of Rome, and for the next 100 years it was copied. Again and again and again, to the point where it was taught in the classroom. Very, very famous scholars and historians in the decades to come put it in their histories. They assumed it was fact. They never looked at the primary sources. They simply relied on the secondary scholarship. And they were wrong, and they looked foolish. And it wasn't until some 100 years later that Ronald Ridley, a historian, actually went back to the primary sources and said, "Holy smokes, there is absolutely nothing about this happening in the evidence. It's made up. It's fabricated." Again, this is just a rather humorous example of how important it is to actually go to the evidence and rely on the primary source evidence when we look at history. So as you think about how the past actually was in relation to how the video game presents it, you need to be thinking about the primary source evidence. And we'll continue to discuss primary source evidence throughout the course. A great example of these complications and difficulties that we find with dealing with historical sources can actually be found in the Bible. Looking at this book not as a religious text or as religious truth in this case, but as a work of history and as a work of literature. At the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, chapters 1 and chapters 2, we're given two different creation accounts of how God created humanity and how God created the earth. Even though these two accounts are both explaining the exact same event, that is, the creation of the universe, the creation of the earth, the accounts they give and the stories and the details they give are actually somewhat different from one another. In Genesis 1, we have the well-known famous creation account where the earth and the skies and the animals, all of this is created over a period of 7 days. In the second account, though, in Genesis 2, there's no sort of time period or distinction mentioned. Similarly, the Genesis 2 account only talks about the creation of the earth, whereas Genesis 1 has this more cosmic, universal scale of creation. The order of creation also differs a little bit between the two stories. Genesis 1, we have animals created first, and then humanity created at the very end as sort of the perfect creation, the penultimate creation of God. Conversely, Genesis 2, the animals are actually created after man. And it happens that the animals are in fact created for man. They're created for Adam as a helper and as companions for Adam. In Genesis 1, animals, which we said are created before man, they are created simply as part of this grand plan of these 7 days in which the creation of the universe is a preordained phenomenon. And in this Genesis 1 account, man is clearly situated as the ruler of the world, of the universe even. Whereas in Genesis 2, man is simply put in the Garden of Eden to tend it. He's a caretaker for the earth, not this master and ruler of it. Another difference between the accounts comes with the creation of women, the creation of Eve. In Genesis 1, man and women are created together, simultaneously, at the same time. There's no difference or distinction in terms of a hierarchy. In Genesis 2, however, woman is created after Adam, and in fact she's created from Adam, from the rib of Adam. So a very subtle but important difference there. Similarly, in terms of this hierarchy, in Genesis 2, Adam gives the names to all the animals as well as to Eve, to the woman. This is very different in Genesis 1, where no names are given to the animals, and in fact, God is the only person speaking in this situation. Whereas in Genesis 2, we have Adam speaking, we have Eve speaking, we have the serpent eventually speaking, and of course God also speaking as well. Just this quick look at these two creation accounts, which again take place as the first and second chapter of the Bible, is very telling in terms of how we're supposed to wrestle and deal with taking historical texts as truth. A lot of times these texts aren't written to be perfectly accurate in a sort of objective, scientific, historical sense, not in the way that we think of it. And in fact, a lot of the authors of these texts, whether it's Homer or certain aspects of the Bible or these different histories or creation accounts or mythologies, they weren't written to be read historically in a modern sense. So it's actually a mistake for us to take these too literally in a scientific sense. The very fact that chapter 1 of Genesis and chapter 2 of Genesis are in conflict with each other in terms of these details is telling to this effect. This leads us to, in some ways, a more important question, though. Why are there differences? Why in the Bible do we have conflicting accounts? What's the cause of these different details in stark opposition to one another? The truth of the matter is almost always due to the fact that there are different authors and that the authors of these works have their own biases and their own intentions and purposes in creating this literature. So whether we're talking about ancient texts like the Bible, ancient Athenian plays, or church documents from the medieval era, or even more modern works of history, the authors of all of these works always have ulterior purposes and ulterior motives guiding their writing in addition to their own biases they have, again, whether overt or subconscious. In the case of these two creation accounts, there are actually two different authorial bodies behind these two stories. In Genesis 1, this account was written by a source known as the priestly writers. This was a school of belief that believed in the importance of certain rituals of the Jewish faith, such as the Sabbath, hence the 7-day creation where God rests on the seventh day. And also they had their own unique and important beliefs about who God was, what God did, the scope of the world, the scope of the universe, and these sorts of details. So for instance, God in this first creation account is very aloof from his creation. He's very distant. He's the God of the universe looking down upon this much smaller and less important creation of mankind, of the world. Take that to Genesis 2, where God is very much present and anthropomorphic in the account. In Genesis 1, God speaks and things are created. In Genesis 2, God does the creation himself, hands-on. He molds Adam out of the dirt, out of the clay. He pulls the rib out of Adam to form Eve. He has all of these very human-like tendencies. It's a very different way of portraying and describing God than the Genesis 1 account. Again, the reason for these differences are a different group of authors. So the authorial source for Genesis 2 are known as the Elohists, a different set of authors with different beliefs and different needs and interpretations of the faith, of the creation of the world, and of God than the priestly writers. The importance of these different authors and the different interpretations and understandings and purposes of writing is seen just as clearly in the Gospels of the Bible. While Genesis and the Old Testament, the first half of the Christian Bible, talks about the events of the Jewish faith and the Jewish people before the birth of Christ, the Gospels and then the New Testament of the Bible discusses the events, first of Jesus' life, but then also the events of the apostles and the early church after that. So the Gospels are the first 4 books of that New Testament. The first 4 books, these Gospels, being the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first 3 of these books of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are generally referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, coming from the Greek meaning of the same viewpoint. In other words, they have fairly similar ways of going about presenting the life of Jesus from his birth to his death and his reported resurrection to their understanding of his theology, of his teachings, and of his beliefs. The 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, is very different in its presentation, not just of these events, but also of Jesus, of his mission, of his understanding of his own divinity and humanity. So because of that, people tend to look at these first 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as fairly similar in their scope and in their understanding. Like with what we saw with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, however, these first 3 synoptic gospels also have very subtle but very important differences to them. This leads us to ask the question, why do these differences exist? If all 3 of these writers are objectively reporting the life of Jesus, why are there differences in the details? This ultimately stems from 2 main reasons, and these really represent the differences and the construction of all historical primary accounts. Number 1, like we mentioned with the 2 Genesis accounts, is the authorial purpose. What is the intention of writing this text? Why did Matthew, Mark, and Luke feel the need and go about writing down the account of Jesus' life? What is their purpose? Who is their audience? What are they trying to accomplish? These are the questions that guide much of the primary sources we will be looking at. I'll explain how we know this momentarily, but we know that the Gospel of Mark was written first. 15 to 20 years later, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written around the same time, and then the Gospel of John was written last. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke in particular have a lot of conflicting details. Not major details, but details that nonetheless conflict with one another. There's many examples, but here are just a few. In the Gospels, we have this account of Jesus' famous teachings. They're known as the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, but they're known as the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. When Jesus is born, in Matthew, he's visited by magi, whereas he's visited by shepherds in the Gospel of Luke. Many people's natural understandings, especially those who celebrate Christmas, is that Jesus was visited by magi, by shepherds, and this is the birth account of Jesus. That isn't necessarily the way that's presented in the primary sources, though. The first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, has no birth narrative. It begins when Jesus is already an adult. The birth narrative in Matthew versus the birth narrative in Luke is actually quite different. Not only the Magi versus the shepherds, but where Jesus is actually born, one in Bethlehem, one back in Nazareth. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is very young, he has to flee to Egypt because Herod is killing all the newborns, afraid that a king is going to rise up. And there's also this important genealogy in which in Matthew, Jesus' birth is traced all the way back to the famous king of Israel, David. The genealogy in Luke, however, traces Jesus' birth all the way back to Adam, the first man. So they have different focuses. There's other interesting aspects in Luke, too, that don't appear in Matthew, such as the robber who is crucified on the cross next to Jesus, who talks to him, and Jesus gives him salvation. These famous stories of the Good Samaritan or of the women at the well with Jesus, these famous stories only appear in Luke. So getting back to this important and larger question, looking at these Gospels as a historical source or as a work of literature, why do these differences exist when they're describing the exact same event, Jesus' life? Like with the Genesis accounts, the differences stem from the authorial purpose of writing this. Most importantly, who are Matthew and Luke's audience members? Because they're not the same. And because they're not the same, in a lot of ways, this is why we have multiple Gospels going out to multiple reading groups. It's very clear that Matthew's Gospel was written for a Jewish community, for those who either were still of the Jewish faith or who had recently converted from the Jewish faith, but it's very clear that it was written for Jews. The reason we know that is because in Matthew's Gospel, there's all this imagery of Moses, such as the slaying of the innocent, the Sermon on the Mount, the genealogy back to the famous Jewish King David, all these Judeo-focused details and aspects of the story. Conversely, in the Gospel of Luke, it's very clear that Luke's Gospel is written for non-Jews, for Gentiles, and really for all people, for women, for poor, for everyone. This is why Jesus is traced back to Adam, the father of all people, not just the Jews. This is why we have robbers on the cross being forgiven. We have the elevation of women, of Samaritans, who are this kind of outcast Jewish group, and why Jesus is visited by shepherds, the lowest of the low. It's not kings or magi that come and visit Jesus in Luke. It's shepherds. It's poor. It's the common folk. It's the blue collar who come and visit Jesus. The question then is, who's right? How did it actually happen? In a lot of ways, obviously, we do not know the answer. What's important, though, is that we understand why they were presented this way. What was Matthew and Luke's purpose for writing this work? This, of course, is not to say that they are making up this information or that it doesn't have a historical basis or that certain aspects or even a large part of it is not true, that it actually didn't happen. But in presenting this narrative, Luke and Matthew are trying to convince a certain targeted audience of these events. And by making it familiar to them, by bringing in imagery of Moses, or by highlighting the areas where Jesus is the champion of the poor or the champion of women, by doing this, these authors are able to meet this niche audience. Reason number one, then, for why we have these different details in texts and in sources reporting on the same event are these authorial differences, these authorial purposes and intentions. Reason number two is simply that a lot of these authors don't have access to the same information. Even if an ancient historian or a writer was an eyewitness to an event, they still have a fairly narrow lens through which they remember and which they saw that event. This becomes even more problematic as the writers and the authors become less and less contemporary to the events in question. This brings us to an ongoing scholarly debate that's become known as the synoptic question. Dealing with these three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, The question that some scholars have raised is, in what ways did these Gospels rely on one another in their writing and in their transmission? The synoptic theory that most scholars agree with is as follows. The Gospel of Mark was written first. Sometime later, 15 or 20 years, the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke were written at the same time. Despite the fact that they were contemporary, though, the author of Luke did not have access to the Gospel of Matthew, and the writer of Matthew did not have access to the Gospel of Luke. We know this because there are certain accounts, certain stories, certain parables in both of these Gospels that if the other author had known about, they no doubt would have incorporated into their own work. For instance, stories of Jesus helping the poor, women, or marginalized that appear in Matthew that don't appear in Luke. Had Luke known about this, he no doubt would have brought that story into his gospel as it would have fit his larger purpose. Both Luke and Matthew, however, pull heavily from the Gospel of Mark as one of their base sources. Again, we know this because there are certain passages in both Luke and Matthew that are nearly identical, not only with one another, but with the Gospel of Mark, which had been already written and circulated. Similarly, there's very, very similar passages in Luke and Matthew that do not appear in the Gospel of Mark. This leads us to believe that they both had access to a source that wasn't Mark. This source, from the German Quell, is simply referred to as Q. Given this fact, we can ultimately reconstruct the connection between these sources in the following diagram. The Gospel of Luke relies on the Gospel of Mark, the Q source, as well as some other source that neither Mark nor Matthew had access to, just known as the L source. Similarly, the Gospel of Matthew had access to Mark, to Q, and to its own M source. This diagram shows us the very complex and interconnected nature of our sources. This obviously becomes even more complex when we have more sources floating about, especially when we know that there were many sources that existed that we simply no longer have access to. We only know about them through surviving works that mention them, that refer to them, and sometimes that rely upon them. This is true outside of the Bible as well. In ancient Roman history, one of the famous Roman historians is Livy, and he writes this grand account from the beginning, the establishment of the city of Rome, 753 BC, all the way to the time of Augustus, the first emperor, this nearly 800-year span of time. For the period of the Middle Republic, though, from around 264 to 146 BC, it's very clear that Livy relies heavily on the Greek historian Polybius for this information. So like we do as modern-day historians in looking at the past historiography and past historians and scholars to form our opinion, the exact same thing is true with ancient and primary sources relying on older sources to form their own narrative. The ancient world also presents us with a unique dilemma in terms of our primary and secondary sources. While a primary source is supposed to be contemporary to the time period it's talking about, given the huge span of time that the ancient world covers and how long ago it was to present day, we have a little bit more leeway with what constitutes a primary source. For instance, in writing about the foundation of Rome in 753, even though Livy is writing 700 years after this fact, we still consider him to be a primary source. In other words, those who write about the ancient world and who also lived in the ancient world are primary sources, even if they're not perfectly contemporary to the time period. The challenges with wrestling with these sources, both primary and secondary, is at the heart of what historiography is and what the study of history entails. In the last few minutes of this lecture, especially for those who aren't very familiar with history and with the course of world history, we're going to do a very, very brief breakdown of the history of the West. So the history of Western Europe. Obviously, this is not all of world history. There's a lot of rich history in the Native American, in the Americas, in the Far East, in the Near East, in Africa, Eastern Europe, everywhere. I only choose to cover this very brief scope and this very brief period because it happens that many of the video games that we will be looking at, and unfortunately many of the video games that are produced, focus on this small geographic area. After thousands of years of hunting and gathering, humanity eventually discovered agriculture and was able to settle down and start building large cities and large civilizations. Some of the early civilizations were the Egyptians on the Nile River, the Sumerians around the Fertile Crescent on the Tigris and Euphrates River, and then eventually the Greeks in modern-day Greece. There were, of course, other tribes, other people who settled and began growing, but these are the three main areas of culture around the Mediterranean Sea, which will be our focus. Because these civilizations in the Middle East and in Egypt had to rely on the flooding of these rivers to water and irrigate their crops, they needed a very strict and centralized government to ensure that nothing broke down in this complex system of dams and irrigation. This centralized authority was reflected in the government and in the rights that people had in these areas. We had great Sumerian kings, we of course have the Egyptian pharaohs. This is very different than what eventually happens in Greece. Because in Greece, and eventually in Italy and in these other areas, because they are not relying on the flooding of rivers, but they're relying on rainfall, there's no need for this more centralized authority. That's why in Greece we don't have a united Greek civilization, but rather hundreds of smaller city-states dotting the landscape of mainland Greece, the islands of the Aegean, and even the western coast of Turkey. Greece would remain this way for hundreds of years. Even with the rise of powerful city-states, most famously Athens and Sparta, no city-state was able to take control of Greece entirely. The city of Athens gives us many famous buildings, people, and events from the ancient world, including the Parthenon, Socrates, Themistocles, Pericles, all of these great philosophers and thinkers and artists. Athens also uniquely was one of the first places that introduced the concept of democracy as a form of government, something that proved very important for the foundation of our own country. Greece eventually would become united, but not by one of these city-states, rather by the Kingdom of Macedonia to the north, first under Philip II and then under his more famous son, Alexander the Great. Alexander formed this huge empire stretching from Greece all the way east towards India, in which he conquered the Persians, captured Egypt, and formed this widespread empire. After his death, however, the empire was split up, fought over, and eventually parceled out by his generals, this becoming known as the Hellenistic kingdoms. Over to the west, while all this was going on, we had the small city of Rome, which eventually fought its way to become a regional power, and then after defeating the Gauls and Carthage and other enemies, they eventually came to dominate the entire western Mediterranean. Unlike democratic Athens, Rome was a republic, much closer to our current form of government in the United States. Before too long, Rome conquered the eastern Mediterranean as well. The Roman Republic fell to be replaced by the Roman Empire. This wide-reaching empire, which encompassed the entire Mediterranean, would survive for another 500 years. It was only in 476 that, due to barbarian invasions from the north, the empire eventually collapses. The eastern half of the empire, though, later named the Byzantine Empire, actually continues on for another 1,000 years. Moving now from the ancient world into the medieval world, the vacuum that forms with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West is largely filled by the Catholic Church. Thanks to early evangelization by apostles like St. Paul and Emperor Constantine's legalization of Christianity throughout the empire, Catholicism had taken a strong root throughout the Mediterranean. With the collapse of Rome, the Church became the most centralized power in the West, eventually converting the Franks as well as other powerful kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean. It was during this period that we have the first glimpses of what are going to become some of the modern-day countries of Europe, such as Britain and France. The first real challenge to the Church's authority and power came with the rise of Islam in the 600s. The Muslim expanse throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and even to Spain and the Mediterranean eventually led to the famous series of conflicts known as the Crusades, in which Christian knights were sent to Israel to liberate Jerusalem, the holy city, from the Muslims. As you may have seen from video games or from movies, this medieval period also embodied an economic system known as feudalism, in which peasants or serfs worked under nobles and lords who in turn reported to larger powers and kings or bishops in this very hierarchical structure. The medieval era also brought us famous events such as the 100-Year War and the Black Death. The medieval era eventually transitioned into the Renaissance around the year 1500, although different countries throughout the Mediterranean experienced their own Renaissance periods in different times. While this period marked a great rebirth of art, literature, and exploration with the finding of the New World in 1492, it was also a period of great strife and conflict. These years marked the height of the Spanish and the Catholic Inquisition throughout the Mediterranean. This period also marked the famous split within the Catholic Church known as the Reformation, in which Martin Luther and then followers broke off from the beliefs of the Catholic Church for various reasons. This in turn spurned the Catholics' Counter-Reformation, which found a revival of certain beliefs and resulted in a number of changes within the Church itself. The authority of the Catholic Church took a further hit with the Age of Enlightenment. This period saw the foundation of many beliefs and understandings of the world that directly led to the questioning of centralized authority, not only against the Church, but also against larger powers. It was this thinking that ultimately led both to the American as well as the French revolutions. This newfound thinking, with things such as the scientific method or the German school of thought, showed people that it was okay to question and to challenge central authorities and beliefs. In many ways, it's at the heart of what we do as historians. We continue to move closer to the modern period with the age of industry and the age of imperialism beginning around the 1700s. This, of course, marked the Industrial Revolution, the rise of factories and assembly lines, but also the widespread colonialization and domination of most of the world by European powers, most famously the British Empire, which at one point controls 25% of the entire world. This widespread imperialism wouldn't begin to end until the weakening of these European powers with the Second World War. With the waning of Europe, we have the rise of the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, and the Cold War period, which brings us into the early 90s and close to our own lifetimes. This very quick and very dirty overview and synopsis of the world history around the Mediterranean should give everyone at least a starting basis as we approach a variety of topics and a variety of time periods throughout the course of world history. In the next lecture, we'll be moving away from history and looking at some of the basics of video games, including the various genres of video games and what makes video games unique as a form of popular media.